Soon afterwards, Mary set out and hurried away to a town in the uplands of Judah. She went into Zechariah's house and greeted Elizabeth. And when Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the baby stirred in her womb. And then Elizabeth, filled with the Spirit, exclaimed in a loud voice, "Hail Mary, full of grace, blessed are you, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. Who am I that the mother of the Lord should visit me? I tell you, when your greeting sounded in my ears, the baby in my womb leapt for joy. And happy is she who has had faith the Lord's promise to her would be fulfilled." And Mary sang, "My soul tells out the greatness of the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked with favor on his servant, lowly as she is. And from this day forward, all generations will count me blessed. For the mighty God has done great things for me. His name is holy, his mercy sure from generation to generation. He has not forgotten to show mercy to Abraham and his children's children forever." Mother Mary became more and more important to the Christian community as time went on. Mark, the earliest gospel, scarcely mentions her. Matthew and Luke give us our Christmas story, with Mary very much front and center at the beginning of the story. John has her pretty much all over the place. What's going on here? One of the earliest threats to the Christian movement was something called Gnosticism. Not your everyday word, I realize, but the influence it was on Christian thought of a Greek view of reality. It set the realm of the spiritual over against the realm of the material. The realm of spirit, mind, divinity is the realm of reality, life, whereas the realm of matter, body, sex, dirt, diapers, disease, is the source of all our troubles, a kind of cage in which we are caught for a time. For this crowd, salvation meant a kind of wisdom and experience through which one was able to escape the material world into a purely spiritual existence, something available, by the way, only to certain spiritually minded people. And Jesus, they argued, was a divine being who slipped into this world, took on the appearance of a human being for a time in order to enable a select few to achieve this wisdom and this spirituality. As a divine being, Jesus did not become involved in truly earthly, physical, mortal life. And many of this persuasion even denied that he hungered or suffered or even died. More to the point, many of the women who flocked to these new movements rejected marriage and childbearing as antithetical to true spiritual existence. Now, this would be nothing but ancient history and of no interest to any of us this morning if it weren't for the fact that this view of reality has been a temptation ever since. The temptation to separate the spiritual from the mundane duties of life, the everyday, workaday world. Harold Bloom of Harvard, for example, insists that a lot of American piety is in fact Gnostic at bottom, is focused on the achievement of religious experience which delivers from the oppression of life in this humdrum everyday world. So Mary increasingly came to center stage in the thought of Christians because Mary was the guarantee that Jesus was a truly human being, earthly, born of Mary, suffered, died. Mary had a baby. And says the old story, in that very earthly act, the Almighty Creator himself made his way into this fallen, imperfect world of stuff and matter to, over time, transform it, turn it into his realm. Thy kingdom come on earth. So the reality is, marrying, birthing, nurturing to life is about as this worldly, material, and as an enterprise as there is. Oh, to be sure, it has its rewards. But it is also, I am told, taxing, tiring, endless responsibility, especially in a time of careers and countless other obligations. Raising kids is tough. and a pretty earthly occupation. Homework, hockey, books, baths, coughs, croup, arguments, acrobatics, one of the most strenuous enterprises around. And on the face of it, it hardly seems the most spiritual of experiences. But it is. Of all the myriad needs of these little earthlings that enter our world, there are two that our faith sees as absolutely essential to their future in this world. Mary sings of what? Mary sings of justice and mercy. God is present to us preeminently as the experience of law and grace, discipline and embrace, accountability and affirmation. But these are experiences that are not derived from theological tomes nor exotic experience. They're learned in very basic and primary relationships, including and especially with, guess who? Mother. Children need the disciplines of life because children are not born with moral character. There's been a relatively recent tendency to see the child as essentially innocent and pure, corrupted only as this world gets a hold of him or her and works its abusive way, warps his psyche, traumatizes his soul. If it weren't for bad parents, bad schools, bad neighborhood, children would grow up good and pure as driven snow. But of course, we can hold on to this incredibly naive picture of children only by closing our eyes. Children are adorable and aggravating, giving and willful, charming and destructive, winsome and sometimes uncontrollable. And anybody with eyes knows that. And unless there are caring adult figures who say no as well as yes, who check, restrain, channel, expect, discipline, the child develops no inner control, no conscience, no capacity to direct his life. The presence of moral law at the heart of our faith says loud and clear that neither we nor our children can get on in life by doing what we feel like. Yielding to impulse, expressing our every desire, insisting on what we want can be destructive of both ourselves and society. And if the person closest to the child does not do the job, chances are it will not get done right. James Carroll describes how he remembers it. I think of waking up on dark winter mornings to my mother's sharp voice, "Get up, up, get up." And then 4 minutes later, I said, "Get up, you'll be late." And I know that even now, the temptation to sleep forever, to roll over, to refuse the day, is as powerful in me as it was on those cold days when I hated the thought of school. Now that the stakes are higher, and the question is whether I will live or not, that calling voice of my mother is still there having its impact. I do get up, I do seize the day, I do accept responsibility for a piece of the earth, for a portion of time, but it's more than me doing it. Left to myself, I probably have overdosed on sleep or its equivalent long ago. When I was a boy, Mom refused to leave me to myself. She affirmed me, shook me, challenged me, called me, and I responded. I formed the habit of getting up, of going out, of living. I took and continue to take her calling with me. It's one of the ways she lives with me to this day. Of course, part of our problem may be the assumption that we're supposed to be loving to our children and be loved by our children. We conclude that love, therefore, precludes any severity, but real love for our children has very little to do with sentiment. Real love is a matter of doing for our children and for one another, for that matter, that which we need, not that which we want. I think the late supermother, Irma Bombeck, caught it beautifully. She once wrote, "You don't love me. How many times have your kids had that one on you? And how many times have you as a parent resisted the urge to tell them how much?" Someday when my kids are old enough, I'll tell them. I loved you enough to bug you about where you were going, with whom, and what time you would get home. I loved you enough to insist you buy a bike with your own money, even though we could afford it. I loved you enough to stand over you for 2 hours while you cleaned your bedroom, a job that would have taken me 15 minutes. Yes, I loved you enough to say, yes, you may go to Disney World on Mother's Day. I loved you enough to let you see anger, disappointment, disgust, and tears in my eyes. I loved you enough to admit that I was wrong at times and ask for your forgiveness. I loved you enough to ignore what you said that every other mother said. I loved you enough to let you fail. I loved you enough to let you assume the responsibility for your own actions at 5 or 10 or 16. I loved you enough to accept you for what you are, not what I want you to be. But most of all, I loved you enough to say no when you hated me for it. That was the hardest part of all. Mary sings of justice, and Mary sings of mercy. With her son, she insists that this unfailing discipline must always be within the context of a relationship of unconditional embrace. Even in Jesus' day, they thought the child had no intrinsic worth, no worth of its own. Not until adulthood, when he had proven himself a contributing member of the community, did he have standing with God and man. But Jesus called a child and set him in front of them, or was it a her, and said, "Of such is the kingdom." The child has infinite worth long before it can make any contribution, earn its own way. And I suggest that every mother from Mary to this day knows that in her bones. If our discipline and guidance is to be enabling, it must always be within the context of an unfailing, faithful affirmation, because it is this that gives the strength, the security to keep on trying, to live up to the expectations of parents, even more of God. Martin Copenhaver said this of his mother at her memorial service: "My mother was such a person for me as she was for many others. Family and church were two of the great loves of my mother's life, and they were intertwined in unique ways. She was a singular inspiration to all of us. I think the reason she was such a shining light to 3 generations is that she taught all of us about God without saying a word. In a family such as ours, there was never a shortage of people who could talk. But she reflected God's gift of love. You know, in many relationships, we are used to having love bear a little bit of a price tag, perhaps tucked away, largely unhidden, often unnoticed, but unmistakably there. Nevertheless, do this and I'll love you a whole lot more, is the message we receive somewhat subtly. But my mother came as close to giving unconditional love and affirmation as anybody I've known. Someone said about her, she made everyone feel like the guest of honor. And not many people can pull that off. And she did it not as a conscious strategy, but as a natural, unself-conscious expression of the spirit of hospitality that was hers. She accepted others to a startling degree. Gracious is the word that most of you have used about her in describing her, and that's entirely fitting, because the word grace means, does it not, the gift of a love that is freely given. Let me add that this is not only something the children need from us, but something we also need from one another. The need for guidance and acceptance, perhaps, but certainly love. During her first week away from home, Anne, a college freshman, wrote home for the first time, and Mother, reading between the lines, sensed that she was lonely and in need of a hug. So Mother made a surprise visit to Anne's campus and her dormitory, and she discovered that Anne was out, had a full schedule of classes for the day, and would not return for hours. So Mother decided to go into town and return later. But before leaving, she left a very complimentary note behind, which she signed, "A Secret Admirer." When Mother returned, Anne immediately thanked her for the nice note. "How did you know it was from me?" Mother asked. Anne replied, because it was in the same handwriting as the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, and Santa Claus. I've been talking about mother this morning. How can I, with any integrity, because I've never been one? Well, I'll let you in on a secret. I have one. And this is what she did and still does for me. She loves me. And I believe that Jesus learned this from Mary. And I believe that most of our mothers do provide another generation with unfailing guidance and accepting love. Not perfectly. We need to remember that in our parenting and with respect to our own parents. All parents fail their children in some measure. No parent ever has enough love, enough wisdom, enough maturity. But even imperfectly, we have the incredible gift and responsibility of reflecting toward our children not just our own wisdom and care, but the very will and love of God. So it's no wonder we do not always do it well. But what a wonder that we're even called to do it at all. Called, by the way, not just as mothers, but fathers, grandmothers, and grandfathers, scout leaders, teachers, friends, to mimic and mirror the affirming and challenging love of God as we know it in Mary and Jesus. If there's any problem with our culture and time, it is that mother is so often left alone to do the job, the incredible job, all by herself. John Claypool tells a wonderful story about the difference between mother and others. A story about a married couple who had an only son. The little boy had been working for weeks at school on a special Christmas surprise for his dad, a handmade tray for him to place on his desk. The day of the holiday open house arrived, and the boy went to school tingling with obvious excitement, knowing that this was the morning he would finally be able to present the handmade treasure to his dad. As the parents came down the hall toward the classroom, the boy peeked out, the clumsily wrapped gift clutched behind his back. Suddenly unable to contain his excitement any longer, the little fellow rushed out and down the hall to meet them, and then he stumbled and fell flat on his face on the hard tile floor, and the fragile gift broke into pieces. Heartbroken, he burst into tears. The father, trying to be helpful, dismissed the accident, saying, "It's all right, son, it really doesn't matter." But the boy simply cried all the harder. It was his wise mother who understood her child. She reached over, took his hand. "No," she said tenderly, "it does matter. It matters very, very much. The gift that you worked so hard on is broken." The boy nodded his head and began to calm down. Someone had understood. "I'll tell you what let's do," his mother continued. "Why don't we gather up all the pieces and take them home and see what we can make out of them?" Which I think is a lot like the love of God, a God who knows that our mistakes wound us and knows how much they matter, but he's always there waiting to help us make something new from the small, transparent, disconnected, broken pieces of our lives. You know, in all of this, he may wear the name Father, but much of the time he acts, I think, more like Mary, full of grace. Well, how to connect all this to Mozart? Well, the last concert tour of Mozart was in the company of his mother, culminating in Paris, where she died. Married to Mozart? Well, they both sing. They sing of the love of God, as did our moms, I'll wager. And I suspect that it is in their songs that God still comes closest to you and me.